this will be the last of our series of nervous tissue lectures, and actually it's like this is where you'll see a lot of information. Like some of the terms here aren't even covered in your OpenStax book, but the thing is that this is why I provide a lot of supplemental information. And this is one thing when you're studying for exam 3. And oh yeah, there was a question in the fact, like what's on exam 3? Pretty much the entire nervous system. And keep it limited to what we cover in the books and lecture, because like the thing is that there's so much about the nervous system, there's so much about neuroscience. If you search some of these topics online, you're going to find a lot of information. You're going to be overwhelmed, especially about things involving chemicals and neurotransmitters. You're going to find a whole treasure trove of things. So again, I'm kind of keeping a tight ring around what I cover during the nervous system, because again, neuroscience is amazing, but it's also a very complex and wide field. So again, you can study those extra things. You can ask them in PACBAC too, like so many things. Exam 2s, people are still taking it. So after the last person is done with their makeup exam, then I'll be releasing results. And people are asking if they can see their exams. So again, the thing is that when I get the exam reports, all I get is numbers. I don't see the questions and answers. So it's kind of hard to give out exam reports. But I think the Top Hat TA and I are working on a way to kind of get like a pseudo report. It won't tell you exactly what answers, but it will provide some feedback. That one we're trying to work on with a freelancer about that. Okay. So now we talked about neurons and neuroglia, and we start with, so let's see, start with, ion channels and action potentials, but how do neurons communicate with each other? That's what we're going with here. So yeah, do they just text each other? How do they communicate? How do they tell other neurons what to do? How do they carry signals? How do they interpret signals? How do they send signals to your other cells in the body? All right, so then we have a presynaptic and postsynaptic cell, and we barely covered, like, we touched upon axon terminals and synapses. And then here we have is that presynaptic and postsynaptic cell, and that synaptic cleft, again, that's the space between a presynaptic and postsynaptic cell. So the synaptic cleft itself is not actually a solid thing. It's not exactly space either, like in terms of like just air and a void. It is extracellular fluid, but what I'm getting at here is that, yeah, the presynaptic cell and postsynaptic cell and the space between. And the synaptic cleft is where all the action happens. So right here we have the axon from that presynaptic cell, again, before the synapse. And then this is where the axon ends. And here we have action potentials, and then we have action potentials traveling towards the axon terminal. So then here we have the two neurons, and what are they doing? They're synapsing on each other. So you see the telodendria and the axon terminals. Now you see in this presynaptic cell, it's extending this, it's making a new synapse and connection between the telodendria and the axon or the dendrites of a postsynaptic cell. Now what is it doing? So again, sending these action potentials, those changes in membrane potential due to the movement of ions, is traveling along the axon and down the telodendria to the axon terminals, and then causing signals at the synapses. And then what we have here, well, the thing is that, is it always just one cell to one cell? Not always. In fact, typically you have multiple neurons for communicating with each other. So what we have here is multiple neurons, and they're presynaptic neurons. Actually, multiple neurons sending action potentials, sending signals onto one downstream postsynaptic neuron. So you can have multiple neurons telling one neuron what to do. The opposite is also true. So then now that neuron is going to send its own action potential. But again, is it always one-to-one? So in the previous example, we have multiple neurons telling one neuron what to do. Now in this example, we have one neuron, but now it's forming multiple synapses with multiple postsynaptic neurons. So in this case, what we have is one neuron sending action potentials and signals, and these are going to travel down the telodendria, and now we have multiple downstream neurons. So what we have is it's one neuron telling multiple neurons what to do. So again, it's not always one-to-one. And these are neural circuits. So what we have here, so the first part where I showed like multiple neurons telling one neuron what to do, that's what you call convergence. So when things converge on a point, they all come together on one point, right? And divergent, well, what does that mean, right? Divergence means like going off different directions, right? So that's what we see here. One neuron telling multiple neurons what to do. Serial processing, and then here's a sequence. So this is one-to-one, and you're just propagating that signal from one neuron. It's kind of like a relay. And then parallel processing, you do have some divergence, but now multiple neurons are carrying that signal at the same time. And reverberation, this is very interesting, but now you have actually a loop. This neuron is telling this neuron what to do, but tells the first neuron what to do. So they're both like their own presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons. And if types of neuronal pools, these are what I'll limit it to. And especially if you're like interested in engineering or computer science, I mean, you might hear these terms as well, serial and parallel processing. I'm pretty sure they borrowed that from actually I should check if computer science came up with it first or if the neuroscientists came up with it first. But again, these are the types of neuronal pools. It can be much more complex or a combination of these, but these are the ones I'm limiting it to for this class. All right, so the thing is that when you have multiple instances of convergence, divergence, and reverberation, serial and parallel processing, you form a neural network. So the thing is that multiple neurons, they can form multiple synapses with other neurons. They can receive signals from multiple neurons. They can transmit signals to multiple neurons as well. And what we have here, so we have multiple neurons forming a network of synapses. So what we have here, a signal traveling along the action potentials of the axon of one neuron, and now it's spreading to other neurons. And this is carrying that same kind of like, it's carrying a signal all the way through a network of neurons. And what we have here, so the thing is that what's one strength of forming multiple synapses? Notice that there's multiple ways for this whole neural net to send action potentials and signals and activate this neuron down here. So again, this is why it's important to form those networks in your brain, because again, multiple ways to activate the same neuron. And this is why synapses are very important. And I think this is currently the dominant theory about how we learn, how we're intelligent, how we form memories, is that we have 100 billion neurons, but we have like almost 10 to, or not 10, not 10, bad math, okay. We have over 1,000 to 10,000 more synapses. So this is a crazy thing. So things that neurons can have thousands of synapses. I actually showed you a very simplified, not realistic model of that. Things that neurons can tell multiple like thousands of neurons what to do or receive signals from thousands of other neurons. And some neurons, such as like the Purkinje neurons, they can have up to 100,000 synapses. So they're telling many other neurons and cells what to do. So the thing is that these synapses, these routes of communications between neurons, they're very important to how our nervous system functions. Now here's another neural net. So the thing is that what happens? Well, notice that here, we're starting to lose some synapses. So what happens to the signaling in this neural network? Well, this neuron is trying to send the action potential, but since it lost some of those synapses, is that signal now able to travel all the way down to this neuron? If there's no synapse, there's no connection, then this signal doesn't end up anywhere. And this is where we have something called synaptic plasticity and learning. So what is synaptic plasticity? So some sort of flexibility and malleability. That means some sort of like, you can have changes in the formation and also the synapses are formed, but they're also degraded and lost as well. So the thing is that our brain is always kind of making these synaptic connections, but also pruning them back and disconnecting them as well. So the thing is that, again, synaptic formation is associated with learning because, again, you have all these neurons, but they don't work alone. It's through their interactions that you have neurons doing all this, like, it's the connections that actually leads to the overall function of the nervous system. So more synapses can be formed to strengthen memories. So like say you have a stimulus and a signal and it tries to evoke a memory. Well, the thing is like if you're forming more synapses and more neurons that the signal can travel through, then it's more likely you're going to have that connection between that signal and that memory. So here we have that example. So here we have all of these neurons right here. And this neuron is kind of sending signals down to each postsynaptic neuron. So this signal and stimuli is traveling all the way down this neural network. But How can you make that even stronger? Well, one way you can make it stronger is make more connections. So when you make more connections, what happens is that now the signal has multiple routes that can reach that same target neuron right here. And if you make even more, well, what happens if those connections disappear? Well, if you have a network versus just one linear relay, like that serial processing where it's just 1 to 1 to 1 to 1, because if you have multiple connections already formed, even if you lose a connection, now this signal can travel through other routes and other neurons. So it's like having multiple roads to get to somewhere versus like if you're like if you live like on Kauai, like you have that one main road, but if there's traffic on that road, you can't go anywhere because none of the other roads go around it. So the thing is that if you have multiple routes to a place, if there's a traffic accident in one place, well, you can go around that traffic accident, right? So this is why these networks are important. There are multiple ways to cause that same sort of signal. So the thing is that the strength, and I actually don't think potentiation is in the OpenStack's book, but if you're going to neuroscience or if you really like the brain, the thing is that synaptic connections is more than just making a connection. There's also different strengths of connections. Some of these connections, like a signal from one neuron to another, might be very weak. It might not be enough to cause another action potential, whereas in some, if it have a very strong potentiated synaptic connection, then it can possibly cause an action potential. Actually, it's better just demonstrated by this next picture. So potentiation is more than just forming the synapse itself. The synapse itself also has its own strength. So here's a normal synapse, and what we have here, so neurotransmitters being released in that space we call the synaptic cleft, binding to these receptors and ion channels, right? Remember those chemically gated or ligand gated ion channels? So we have neurotransmitters opening these channels and allowing these ions to flow through. Now with the potentiated, what do you notice? So you still have the same synaptic cleft, it's still one synapse, but in this potentiated synapse, what we have is more neurotransmitter being released. More neurotransmitter means more of these ion channels opening. You have more sodium and more calcium ions flowing into the cell. So you get a stronger flow of ions it's again, same, just one synapse, but by changing the amount of neurotransmitter that's released, by changing the amount of ion channels that open in response on that, or the number of ion channels in that synapse, that can actually cause a stronger signal. So this is what potentiation is. It's strengthening of a synaptic signal. Again, it's not multiple synapses in this point. We're just talking about one synapse. But you can dial up the volume. That's what's kind of like doing it. And this is actually very important in learning and memory. So if you're in psychology or if you're really interested in neuroscience, long-term potentiation and memory, lots of studies that involve this. But again, it all involves ionic movement and neurotransmitters.